Alright, I know what you're thinking. This is just another anti-Nintendo video from Nintendine, but it's not that. Trust me, this one is going to be good. So initially, while working on today's talk, my plan was to do a bunch of research and go on for about 20 minutes about all of the different price drops that every console has faced throughout the past 35 years. And obviously, the whole theme would have been how the Nintendo Switch 1 has yet to get a price drop, and how every other console managed to do more price drops and make more sales, yada yada yada. I still want to maybe do that video, but for another time. That one can wait. Because I think it is a fun history lesson to see how consoles gain more sales based off of the price drops. That's fun to look at if you like numbers, even if you're studying it for non-anti-Nintendo purposes. But what I actually accidentally discovered was that many of us are pretty wrong about the talking point of what people were paying for consoles back in the 90s versus today, and potentially even leading up to the 2000s. So keep in mind, I'm going to be primarily looking at North American numbers in US dollars, because that's where I'm from, but I imagine there are similar ideas around the world. So I want to start with the 4th generation, and specifically the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. Sorry TurboGrafx, not today. So as many people would know, the Sega Genesis, as well as the Super Nintendo, launched in the United States for $200. The Genesis arriving in 1989 and the Super Nintendo arriving in 1991. If you average the value of $200 in '89 and 1991 out, depending on which calculator you use, you'll probably learn that those consoles were worth roughly $500 in today's market. Which is a big talking point, right? That's what people want you to hear. That's what they want you to believe was the cost of the console back then. It's basically in line with what the current cost of the consoles is now. But there's a bit of a problem. By the time we hit 1992, after undergoing 2 or 3 different price cuts across both of the consoles, they were both selling for $99.99, which I guess is normal, right? I mean, consoles go through a price cut. After the majority of sales go at the console's launch, the rest of them get sold at price cuts later on. As the hype dies down, they sell fewer and fewer, and they offset that by bringing more people to the table by lowering the price. At least that's been the pattern through most of my lifetime anyway. But for the 4th generation, that wasn't exactly the case. Prior to 1992, the Sega Genesis had sold 3.1 million units in North America, and the Super Nintendo, being the newer console, had only sold 2 million in its launch year, and both consoles ended up with roughly 20 million-ish sold in North America, each, reaching pretty close to that number by the mid-90s, right before the launch of the PlayStation 1 and the Nintendo 64, which tells me that even though these consoles launched at $200, a vast majority of them were actually purchased at only $100, with peak sales landing roughly in 1993, which means that while many people like to justify the current price of consoles by insinuating that the 4th generation consoles were $200 in 1990-ish, which comes out to $500 today, in actuality, the consoles were mostly purchased starting from 1992 and onwards at only $100, which translates to roughly $230 in today's market. Again, depending on which month and which calculator you use. But at minimum, I think it's safe to assume that most people that bought the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis did not buy it at $500 of 2025 post-inflation conversion. No, they actually bought it at what is the equivalent of today's $230 value. $230 today can get you a Switch Lite with no games. The Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis had bundles. But that's fine, that was the 90s, gaming was different back then, single income homes were prevalent, consoles were not as powerful, AAA budgets didn't exist. Let's just keep moving along, let's see when it balances out. Let's go to the 5th generation. Primarily the PlayStation 1 and the Nintendo 64 because the Sega Saturn decided to play with a fork and a toaster. The PlayStation 1 launched in 1995 at $299, but with the looming release of the Nintendo 64 in September 1996, less than a year after the PlayStation 1 launch, they dropped the price down $100 to $199 to keep it competitive with the upcoming Nintendo 64. By 1997, both of them dropped down to $149. By 1998, both of them dropped down to $129. And by 1999, they were both at $100, with the PS1 actually further dropping to $50 in 2002, but by then, most of the units were already sold. Now, in the case of both consoles, while they had a decent amount sold at the $149 price tag, most of them were actually sold at $129 or cheaper. Again, this is $129 in 1998. So, real quick, the $299 price tag in 1995 that the PlayStation 1 launched at would technically be worth $636 today, but barely 3% of all PlayStation owners bought it at that price, so let's ignore that one. Even if I remember people using that as an argument as to why the PlayStation 5 was actually cheaper than the PlayStation 1. But that's an outlier, I don't really need it. By 1996, both consoles were selling for $200, which comes out to roughly $415-ish in today's market. That's the launch number that most people use. They say that the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation 1 are worth roughly $415-ish in today's value, so a Switch 2 coming in at $450 is not that much more expensive. Well, as we established, most of those consoles were actually sold at a much cheaper price. Being generous and applying a worst case scenario, we can say that most of those consoles were sold at $130 in 1998, which comes out to $257 today, which is still not enough to get you a Nintendo Switch 1 today, 8 years after its launch. Now, in the 6th generation, it actually starts to get a little bit more interesting. Let's once again ignore Sega because it's easy to, and consider the PlayStation 2, the Xbox, and the GameCube. Now, the PS2 hit the ground running in 2000 and just kept selling. It launched at $299 and didn't get a single price drop until May 2002, where it went down to $199. The Xbox also launched at $299, and similar to the PlayStation 2, it was also dropped down to $199 by May of 2002. The GameCube actually launched at $199, and by May of 2002, it got a price drop down to $149. Now, the PlayStation 2 did sell roughly 15 million up until that point where the price dropped to $199, which is nothing to scoff at, but they did sell significantly more after that price went down. And I'm only talking in North America. The Xbox and the GameCube didn't quite fare as well. Most of their units were sold actually after their price drops. Actually, even from 2003 and beyond, when their price dropped even more, they sold almost as much as they did before that second price drop. But for the sake of being generous, let's look at the number from 2002 and onwards, which is when the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox were going for $199 and the GameCube was only going for $149. You could make an argument that the PlayStation 2 shouldn't be using the 2002 value, and considering it sold a crap ton by then, but in this example, the PlayStation 2 is the outlier. They were just phenomenal. And honestly, if you're giving it that $299 value in the year 2000, it's worth over $500 today. But again, if you consider that a majority of people did not buy it at $299, they bought it at $199 or less, similar to the Xbox, that $199 console in 2002 is worth roughly $360 today, which can just about get you a Switch OLED. And Nintendo's GameCube, at $50 cheaper, in today's market would be worth $270. So basically, so far, outside of those 15 million people out of the 160 million that purchased a PlayStation 2, pretty much everybody is still buying a console today for much more expensive than they would have back then, and that's with the current price drops. Or obviously in the case of Nintendo, no price drops. Because if I need to remind you, the Xbox Series X is going right now for roughly $450 on Xbox.com. And I don't even know what the standard PlayStation 5 is anymore, but the cheapest I'm seeing is roughly $400 for a digital version that comes with Astrobot. So this is all still more expensive than what the vast majority of the people that purchased consoles during the PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube era. How about the 7th gen? This one might actually be a little bit harder to figure out. But I think it's fair to say that the Wii is $249, even though it did have a price cut in 2009, but I think the hype of the Wii was that late 2000s era. $249 in 2006 was worth $400 today. And obviously over the next couple years where they continued to sell the Wii for $249, it drops down another $20-ish. But let's stick with that $400 value. Obviously you also have the pack-in of Wii Sports, which would bring it down something like $20 or $30 in today's market, but whatever, $400 for the Wii. The Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, however, those ones jumped up to anywhere between $500 and $600 depending on which version and what year you're looking at the price. So it's safe to say that the 7th generation might be where the prices started getting comparable to today's prices, and in some cases even more expensive actually. Now keep in mind, I'm looking at the value of the dollar today. If you go back to 2020 where the PlayStation 5 and the Series X actually launched, the value is closer to high 400s, right around the $500 mark. So it's much more comparable. In the case of the Switch, however, that $249 that we had paid for the Wii when it launched in 2017 was worth $306. So yeah, if you account for inflation, the Switch and the Wii and the 360 and the Xbox Series X and the PS5 and the PS3 did launch at roughly the same price. And given that we're 5 years into the life cycle of the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X, and they've seen price drops, the drop in price on those consoles 5 years into their life is once again comparable to the drop in the price of the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 5 years into their life cycle. But in the case of Nintendo, 8 years into the Wii's life, it was going for $130. $130 in 2012 would be worth $183 today. So if you assume that Nintendo Switch probably should have had roughly a $100 price drop by now, you'd be right. And I mean, the same concept goes for the 8th generation. The Wii U can probably be ignored just the same way we ignored the Dreamcast previously, but that thing basically launched for $350, quickly got dropped down to $299, and then the Switch came out for the same price 4 years later. At that point, you're only looking at really a $17 difference between launches. And I think jumping from the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One towards the Series X and the PlayStation 5, you're looking at roughly a $50 difference, with the older consoles actually being cheaper than these newer ones. And finally, looking at the Nintendo Switch, if you were to purchase it for $300 in 2017, in today's market, that's worth $395, which means the Switch 2, if you're going based off of inflation, is roughly $50 more than it should be. But what have we learned today? Well, for starters, we learned that numbers can indeed be very confusing and very misleading. It's sometimes not really fair to compare the launch titles on consoles because as time has gone on, more and more people started to adopt these consoles at launch. Back in the day, probably up until the 7th gen, most people would wait it out. The console was always the most expensive at launch, and that was when the fewest amount of people would actually purchase it. The other thing we learned was that price cuts happen pretty quickly and pretty frequently. Now, credit to the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X, I think they did kind of follow that same pattern, although depending on where you are in the world, they actually increase the price, so yeah, it's kind of tough to gauge that one. But I know that right now, if I went to Microsoft.com or PlayStation.com, I could buy those consoles for less than $500, which is what I couldn't say at launch, not including the digital versions, obviously. Again, the only exception to this entire rule is the Nintendo Switch, which is the first console of my lifetime to not get a single price drop. But not only that, we also learned that pretty much everybody that's purchased a home Nintendo console prior to the Nintendo Switch paid much less for that console than they did for the Switch, outside of the people that bought the Wii at the initial hype for the first couple years. So we're talking almost 30 years worth of Nintendo purchasers paying less than they did in 2017. And of course this mostly applies for Sony and for Xbox outside of those late 2000s and onwards. But even then they weren't paying more. They're paying kind of the same of what we're paying now. And the reason I'm stressing that is because there for some reason is this giant push that currently today we are paying less for our consoles than we would have if we bought the consoles 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And it's just blatantly not true, not for a vast majority of people, because remember, up until the last few generations, most people were not even early adopters. If your argument is comparing the price at launch, sure, compare the price at launch, but you need to consider how many people are actually buying it at launch compared to how many people that used to buy it at launch. And beyond that, you need to consider that the console prices don't go down nearly as much as they used to. There aren't as many price cuts now as there used to be. They were dropping them every year, and that's when most of the people would jump in. At least that's what the numbers are showing. So no, I don't buy into the belief that we're currently paying more for video games now than we would have been 20 years ago, even if you just look at it from the inflation alone. This is not even accounting for the fact that our wages have not kept up with inflation. This is not accounting for the fact that we currently live in a society that requires dual incomes in a single household, and so many more intricate little details that I am not nearly versed enough in economics to get into. And most importantly, this is not even accounting for the fact that the gaming industry has exploded since then. It's massive. They're so much more profitable. They make significantly more sales now than they ever did before. But again, I'm not accounting for any of that. I'm just simply looking at the average price that people paid for consoles back then versus the average price that they're paying for consoles now. And we today are paying much more than we did back in the day. And if you don't believe me, go look up the numbers on yourself. They're online. I'm not pulling this stuff out of thin air. You can find everything on video game sales and it links all the sources. And if you don't trust video game sales, you can check some other sources. I checked like 3 different wikis. And no matter how I spun it, no matter which inflation calculator I used, no matter how much benefit of the doubt I gave towards the console against my argument, at the very worst case scenario, it turns out that we are paying, at best, roughly what they were paying back then. But for the most part, we are paying significantly more. So the next time somebody tries to convince you that what you're paying for a console today is better than what you would have paid back in the day, call them out on it. Tell them that comparing launch prices is not actually an accurate measurement. Most people back in the day didn't even buy it at launch. And most consoles back in the day had a drastic price drop. I'm talking like a third of the price within the first year, second year, or third year. And during those years, that's when most people actually bought in. And I wouldn't be remotely surprised if that's what was going on with the video games as well. Everyone always just pulls up an old Sears catalog that shows that Donkey Kong was like $7,045 or whatever. But no, back then there were used video game stores, there were price cuts, there were discounts, there were sales, and there was Blockbuster Video. And if you want to argue that renting a game is not the same as owning a game, well, I'd say that you were absolutely right. But I would challenge you to figure out how many games that you're currently playing on your console are actually owned by you today. I initially started this video with the thought process that I wanted to see when the Nintendo Switch 1 should have done a price drop. But with my research, I figured out something that I feel is a lot more groundbreaking and a lot more valuable to use in arguments against modern day corporate gamer defenders. And I really hope somebody with way more knowledge and way more time than I have puts together some kind of figure and it gets shared along the gaming community and just goes viral. Because I think the fallacy that we're paying less for video games today than we were back in the day needs to be put to rest. Because quite frankly, unless somebody can show me some numbers that prove otherwise, I don't think it's true. Or at the very least, I don't think it's true for a vast majority of console purchasers over the past 30 plus years. Let me know what you guys think. Thanks again. I'll see you on the next one.